You won't believe what happened in today's story.
The bus exhaled a long metallic hiss and went silent behind him. Ethan Carter stepped down onto the cracked pavement of the station lot, his suitcase following with a dull thud. The air clung wet against his skin, heavy with salt and rust. A pale fog had rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the outlines of the town. He stood for a moment staring down Main Street. The shops were shuttered, their windows blind and lifeless. Clapboard houses sagged under the weight of years, their paint curling like sunburned skin. A single street lamp at the corner flickered with a weak, nervous buzz, on, off, on again, its cone of light no match for the fog. Ethan tightened his grip on the suitcase handle. He had promised himself he would never come back here. Yet here he was, summoned by a phone call from Uncle Harold, with words that carried too much silence around them, unfinished matters. As he walked, his footsteps echoed too loudly on the wet pavement. He passed a row of houses, each window dark. Halfway down the block, he froze. A door banged open, swinging back and forth on rusted hinges. No breeze touched his face, and yet the door moved as if pushed by an unseen hand. He stood listening, his pulse quickening. The silence between the creaks pressed in on him. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath, forcing himself forward. The smell of the sea grew sharper, almost metallic, as if the tide had brought in more than salt. The fog thickened around him, blurring the shapes of buildings until only their shadows remained. Somewhere ahead, faint and skeletal against the gray, the pier jutted out into nothing. Its boards were slick beneath his shoes, groaning with each step. Halfway down, Ethan stopped. Their footsteps behind him, deliberate, measured. He turned sharply. The pier stretched empty into the mist. The sound had already stopped. He told himself it was the wood, expanding and settling. Old wood always did. He didn't believe it. At the far end of the pier, a figure stood, motionless, facing the sea. Ethan felt his throat tighten. The man was tall, his outline blurred by fog, but there was something unnervingly familiar about the way he held himself. "Hello," Ethan called. His voice came out harsher than he intended. The figure didn't move. He stepped closer. The boards moaned under his weight, another step and another. The figure remained silent, still, until Ethan blinked and it was gone. His breath caught. At the end of the pier, the boards were wet and black with seawater. Across them stretched a line of prints, bare feet, impossibly clear, pressed deep into the soaked wood. They led straight to the edge, and ended in the open air. The last footprint hung over nothing. The pier shuddered beneath him, a violent tremor that sent his suitcase crashing onto its side. Ethan staggered back, heart pounding, and then, so close he could feel the breath of it at his ear. "Ethan!" A whisper, his own name. He spun around. No one was there. Part 2, the house. The Carter house sat on the rise above the bay, its windows like blind eyes staring out to sea. The climb up the narrow road left Ethan damp with fog and sweat, his suitcase dragging like dead weight. He paused at the gate, rust biting through the paint, and for a moment he almost turned back. The front door opened before he could knock. Uncle Harold filled the frame, broad-shouldered but stooped, a cigarette clinging to the corner of his mouth. His face was weathered, carved with deep lines that looked older than they should have. "You took your time," Harold said. His voice carried gravel, and his eyes never quite met Ethan's. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with mildew and something faintly sweet, wine, maybe, or rot. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a sound too loud for the space, as though each second had been amplified. In the sitting room, Aunt Clara perched on the edge of a velvet chair, a half-full glass of red wine balanced in her hand. She smiled at him, thin, strained. "Ethan," she said, her voice smooth and brittle, "we hardly recognized you." On the sofa, his sister Martha sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't look up when he entered. Dinner was a tense affair. The table was set with care, silver polished, candles flickering in brass holders, but no one spoke without edge. Harold talked of the house, repairs, bills, the matter of inheritance. Clara punctuated his words with cutting remarks, laughter too sharp to be warm. Martha said nothing at all, her silence a blade. Ethan forced food into his mouth but barely tasted it. His attention kept drifting. The windows were wide open, though the night outside was bitter with fog. He was certain he'd closed them when he came in. On the counter behind him, a fork shifted, just slightly, no one touching it. His pulse quickened. He said nothing. The others didn't seem to notice. Harold poured himself another glass, muttering about debts and obligations. Clara rolled her eyes. Martha finally snapped her head toward Ethan, her gaze cold, unreadable. "You shouldn't have come back," she said quietly. The clock struck 8. The sound rang far too loud, echoing through the house like the toll of a distant bell. Ethan's glass shook in his hand. Part 3, The Dreams. That night's sleep came in fragments, jagged and restless. Ethan drifted in and out, tugged down by exhaustion only to be yanked awake by the sense of someone standing too close. When he finally dreamed, it wasn't peaceful. He was small again, running barefoot across the cold sand of the beach. Fog pressed against his skin, thick enough to choke. Somewhere ahead, voices rose, his father shouting, his mother sobbing, the deep growl of his grandfather in the midst of an argument. The words blurred, but the anger was sharp, cutting through the roar of the surf. A shape loomed in the mist, his grandfather, broad and furious, pointing toward the water. Behind him stood Uncle Harold, his face half hidden in shadow. Ethan tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. Then the ground dropped beneath his feet, and the sea closed over him. He woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat. The room was cold, too cold. Curtains stirred in a draft, and when he turned his head, he saw the window gaping open. He was certain he'd latched it before bed. Pushing himself up, he crossed to it, shivering as the fog rolled in through the gap. The yard below was a blur of gray and shifting shadow. He gripped the frame to pull it shut and froze. Down on the beach at the edge of the tide, a figure stood watching the house. Small, still, impossible to make out through the mist, but unmistakably there. He blinked, the fog thickened, and the figure was gone. Ethan closed the window with shaking hands, his reflection pale in the glass. He pressed his palm to the frame, willing it to stay shut. But the tick of the hall clock echoed faintly through the silence, louder with each passing second, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the dream hadn't ended at all. Part 4, Conversations. Morning crept into the house in muted gray, the fog pressing against the windows like damp cloth. Ethan came downstairs to the sound of raised voices. In the kitchen, Aunt Clara was already drinking, her glass filled too high, crimson spilling onto the rim. She gestured sharply with her free hand. "You've buried us in debts, Harold. Don't you dare make this about me." Uncle Harold stood at the stove, a cigarette clamped between his teeth though he hadn't lit it. His voice was low, dangerous. "You think you're above all this. You're as tied to this house as the rest of us." Clara laughed, brittle and sharp. "This house, it's a coffin, Harold." Martha sat at the table, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on nothing. She looked up only when Ethan entered. Her face was pale, drawn tight. She didn't speak. "I think I've heard enough," Ethan muttered, reaching for the coffee pot, but his voice only seemed to sharpen the air. Harold turned on him. "And what about you? You think you can waltz back in here after all these years and judge us?" "I didn't come here to judge anyone," Ethan said evenly. "You asked me to." "I asked you to settle matters," Harold snapped, "not to stir them up." The words hung in the air, sour and heavy. Ethan let them drop. He poured himself coffee, though his hands shook enough to rattle the cup against the saucer. As he turned, something caught his eye. On the sideboard stood a framed photograph he had never seen before. Dusty, old, yet not there yesterday. He set his cup down and stepped closer. The picture was faded, the edges curled, a family portrait taken on the very steps outside this house. His grandfather, stern and immovable, his grandmother beside him, younger, her smile stiff. Behind them, Harold, Clara, and their siblings. But there was another child in the photo, a boy he didn't recognize, dark hair, solemn eyes, standing just slightly apart from the rest. He looked familiar in a way Ethan couldn't place. "Where did this come from?" Ethan asked, lifting the frame. Clara barely glanced at him. "What are you talking about?" "This photo," Ethan insisted, turning it toward them. Harold frowned. "That's not ours." Martha's chair screeched back. She stood abruptly, her face flushed. "Stop it," she snapped, her voice shook. "Just stop." Before Ethan could reply, she left the room, footsteps quick up the stairs. The silence that followed was worse than the argument. Ethan looked back at the photograph. The boy's eyes seemed fixed on him, sharper now, as though the fog of the faded picture had cleared just enough. He set it down slowly, but his pulse refused to calm. Part 5, The Beach. The fog lingered through the afternoon, heavy as wool, muffling every sound. By dusk, Ethan could no longer stand the closeness of the house. He slipped out the back door, following the path down to the shore. The beach stretched pale and empty, the sand slick with tide water. Old pilings jutted from the surf like rotted teeth, coated in green weed. The cry of a gull broke the silence, then vanished into the gray. Ethan walked slowly, suitcase forgotten, back at the house. Each step sank deep, the sand cool against his shoes. The salt stung stronger here, mixed with a faint metallic tang he could almost taste. The memory came unbidden the night his grandfather died. He had been young then, woken by shouting, pulled toward the window by curiosity and dread. He remembered voices rising on the beach, accusations, desperate, raw, then a shape tumbling, swallowed by black water. Afterward silence, no one spoke of it, not really. Now, standing in the same place years later, the memory felt fresh enough to sting. A sound drew him deeper into the fog, a splash quick and deliberate. He turned his head sharply. Nothing, just the water heaving against stone. Then he saw them, footprints in the wet sand. Bare, small, too clear to be old. They led away from him, toward the rocks at the edge of the cove. Ethan's breath caught. He followed, each step quicker than the last. The prints continued, crisp in the damp sand, always just ahead. "Wait," he called without thinking. His voice sounded wrong, swallowed, and thrown back in strange echoes. The prints led almost to the rocks, narrowing where the tide lapped in. Just before he reached them, a voice cut through the fog. "Ethan!" He spun. His sister stood a few paces behind, her face pale, eyes wide with something more than anger. "What are you doing?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. Her fingers dug into his sleeve. "Don't follow." He looked back toward the sand. The footprints were gone. The stretch of beach lay smooth, untouched except for his own. "I saw," he began. "No," Martha said sharply. "You didn't. You don't want to." She pulled him back, away from the rocks, away from the tide. The fog pressed in thicker, swallowing the place where the footprints had been. Ethan let himself be led, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The silence between them said more than words could. Part 6, the attic. The attic smelled of mold and time. Ethan pushed open the heavy door, its hinges protesting with a low, whining creak. Dust motes floated in the weak light of the single bare bulb. The space was cluttered with crates, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and stacks of forgotten memories. He moved carefully, each step stirring the dust, each creak of the floorboards echoing in the confined space. Among the boxes, something caught his eye, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. He picked it up, blowing off the thick layer of dust. The handwriting inside was shaky, hurried, and unmistakably old. It belonged to his grandfather. The entries were fragmented. "He came again today. The children must not know. Steps at night, always outside the window." Ethan flipped further. The ink blurred, streaked with moisture, but one sentence remained clear. "He will not leave us." A shiver ran down his spine. The words felt alive, as if the paper itself pulsed with a warning. He turned, intending to leave the attic, and froze. The boards under his feet groaned. Another creak followed, then another, faster. Someone or something was moving behind him. He spun around, empty air. The attic door stood closed, undisturbed. Breathless, he clutched the diary and backed toward the stairs. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, reaching for him. For a moment he thought he heard a whisper, faint, just behind his ear. "Ethan." He bolted down the stairs, heart hammering, the journal held tight to his chest. Behind him, the attic fell silent once more. Part 7, cracks in the house. By the next day, the house itself seemed alive with quiet menace. Doors shifted slightly on their frames, lights flickered for no reason, and the faint creak of footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Every sound set Ethan on edge. Harold drank more heavily than usual, muttering to himself while checking locks and windows that had already been secured. Clara's laughter had taken on a brittle, sharp edge, as if any moment it might break. Martha moved through the house silently, retreating to her room whenever he tried to speak to her. Ethan found himself unable to ignore the growing unease. He followed subtle signs. A vase moved an inch, a chair turned slightly, lamps that blinked out in perfect synchrony with his own blinking eyes. One evening, he confronted Martha in the dim hallway. "You hear it too, don't you?" he asked, voice low. She turned to him sharply, eyes wide and hard. "Shut up," she hissed. "If you speak of it, you'll ruin everything." He studied her face. There was fear there, raw and unspoken, something he had never seen before. It mirrored his own, though he tried not to admit it. Later, alone in the kitchen, Ethan heard the faint scrape of metal from the basement. He froze. A shadow passed along the wall, not human, not yet fully formed, but unmistakably deliberate. His pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed that the house was testing him, revealing cracks not just in the walls but in the very fabric of the family. He couldn't tell what was real anymore, the moved furniture, the whispers, the flickering lights, or if it was simply his mind unraveling under years of buried secrets. Yet one truth remained: something in this house didn't want him, or anyone, to leave untouched. Part 8, Night at the Pier. The fog was thick when Ethan left the house that night, rolling in from the bay like a living thing. Every step toward the pier felt like wading through water, heavy and reluctant. The familiar boards creaked beneath his shoes, damp and slick with salt. At the end of the pier a figure waited, still, silent, the same outline he had seen days before, half-shrouded in mist. "Who are you?" Ethan called, his voice tight, trembling against the fog. The figure didn't respond. Its stillness pressed down on him as though the air itself were heavier near it. Ethan stepped closer, heart hammering, every instinct screaming both fear and recognition. When he reached it, the figure turned slowly. The face, it was his own. Not exactly him, but unmistakably so, the same features, the same haunted eyes. Ethan stumbled back, a cold weight gripping his chest. The figure didn't move again. Then, with a final exhalation, it dissolved into the fog. The smell hit him first, iron, sharp and raw, like blood left out to dry. His stomach churned. On the boards where the figure had stood were footprints. Small, childlike, pressed deep into the wet wood. They led to the edge and then stopped abruptly, hovering over the void. The pier shuddered. Ethan's heart leapt, his hands shaking. The whisper came, soft but clear. "Ethan." He spun, nothing, just the wind and the mist, carrying a faint metallic tang, like the remnants of something lost long ago. He didn't move for a long moment, staring at the water, the footprints, the fog, and the emptiness. And for the first time he understood. He wasn't chasing a ghost, he was chasing memory. The pier creaked again beneath his feet. He took a step back, almost falling, and in the distance the lights of the town blinked, unsure of their own presence. Part 9, Revelation. The diary from the attic had changed everything. Leafing through the fading pages, Ethan finally understood the truth his family had buried. His grandfather had a son by another woman, someone outside the family, someone the others had never spoken of. The night that boy had died, tangled in the same storm and surf Ethan had witnessed as a child, the family had hidden it. No one had ever found the body, and no one had ever talked about it again. The fear, the shame, the guilt, it had been passed down silently, like a curse. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the journal open before him, the words swimming in the candlelight. And then he saw it again, the photograph from the sitting room, the boy in the picture, the one who didn't belong, his features somehow reflected in Ethan's own. It wasn't coincidence. He realized with a hollow ache that the boy in the photo, the one who had haunted his visions, the figure in the fog, was the son of his grandfather, the one who had never returned, and in some strange, twisted way, the echoes of that boy had followed him his entire life. When he tried to explain it to Martha, her reaction was fierce, almost violent. "Don't speak of it," she shouted, slamming her bedroom door. Her voice trembled. "If he comes back, everything will happen again." Ethan pressed his forehead to the cold wood of the table. The truth was more than shocking, it was unbearable. The boy, lost to the sea, had become a memory that refused to die, a presence that clung to their family like a shadow. He wondered if all the strange occurrences, the footprints, the whispers, the figures in fog had been tied to that loss. The house, the pier, even their own minds, they were haunted not by a ghost but by memory itself. And now that memory was awake. Part 10, The Last Night. The wind tore against the house, rattling shutters and doors as though the sea itself demanded entry. Ethan paced the hallways, senses alert to every sound, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of curtains, the distant moan of foghorns across the bay. Suddenly footsteps echoed behind him. He spun, but the hallway was empty. The windows themselves swung open of their own accord, curtains flaring like ghostly wings. Ethan's reflection appeared in the hallway mirror, then shifted, subtly, unnervingly. The boy from the photograph stared back at him, small, pale, silent. Compelled by something he could not name, he left the house, moving toward the pier once more. The fog was thick, heavy, almost tangible, curling around his legs, pressing against his chest. At the end of the pier, the footprints appeared again. Small, childlike, wet, and pressed deep into the boards. The last one hung impossibly over empty air. Ethan's heart thumped violently in his chest. A shudder ran through the pier, and then the whisper came, soft, close, unmistakable. "Ethan." The voice was his own and not his own, the echo of memory and loss, the lingering trace of a boy who had never left. Ethan stepped closer, reaching toward the edge, drawn as if by a hand from the past. The fog thickened, the sound of the waves rose like a chorus, and the pier groaned under a weight that was not entirely his own. In that moment clarity struck him with cold certainty. There was no ghost, no revenant. The presence that haunted them was memory itself, a weight passed down through generations. It did not forgive, and it did not release. The last footprint swayed in the wind, dangling over the void. The whisper came again, insistent. Ethan. He did not flinch, he understood now. The family, the town, the pier, the house, they were all tied to the same unending echo, and it would not let anyone leave untouched. The fog closed around him, the sea whispered, and the pier quivered with the weight of what had been remembered and what would never be forgotten. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, into the void, into the memory, into the truth that would never release him.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.